So the idea of negotiation and negotiating survival comes in when two different groups meet again in 1676. Prior to that, we had those arrangements with the French, as I had earlier discussed about the exchange of women in our cultures as part of a peace process. And this exchange extended to the French that arrived here without their women. So you still owe us some women, France. So this exchange it only guarantees that our families mix their blood with each other, with our neighboring groups. So I appreciate the conversations and discussions that are being held in Facebook on that issue, and it's the women that are leading the discussion, and some men are jumping in the conversation. But I think it's going well. I've stayed out of it, and I want to stay out of it. And this is one of the greatest things about social media, is a lot of information gets brought in, and it gets weaned out, whether it's true or not. The truth prevails most of the time. Anyway, back to the treaty making process. Mostly oral agreements with the French. There was nothing written. And when the English arrived, we started into 1676 at Casco Bay. And then there were many right up till 1700. There were like 1680, 1682, 1690, and 1702. There was another major one in 1702 that that I rely on, a book. It's called The History of Indian Wars by Samuel Penhallow. It was published in 1726 in Boston. And it writes about, and it describes the treaty processes that were entered into. And the one at Casco Bay describes the one earlier, where the two pillars of stone had been established, and the Indians gathering together, joining hands and making a human covenant chain. But also another meaning of that covenant means that the treaties were linked to each other. It was the British Crown that entered into those treaty relationships with the eastern tribes, the eastern Algonquian speaking groups from Boston all the way up to Nova Scotia, and even included Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. But that's not the name that was applied to the Ile Saint Jean, the Saint John Indians. And there's also a confusion as to the Wolastoqiyik, or the Maliseet people on the Saint John River. They were also called the Saint John Indians. So the Indians of Prince Edward Island, because it was called Ile Saint Jean en français, they were called the Saint John Indians, and Nova Scotia was called New France, or l'Acadie, and there was Cape Breton, Ile Royale. So Ile Royale was another part of the French Empire in North America. And so things started to shape differently. In 1702, they described that treaty process I just mentioned earlier, and I mentioned it again last week, about the joining of the hands and the burying of the hatchet, and things moved on. 1713 was a major event that changed the face of North America. It was the Spanish succession in Europe. And what happened was the Treaty of Utrecht was signed in Holland. And France, England, and Spain gave up its crownly responsibilities over France. And France gave up its possessions in North America, and England took over some of those responsibilities. So that was the Treaty of Utrecht. The Mi'kmaq people, or indigenous people in North America, were not involved in that treaty, and yet it affected the sovereignty or the nationhood of indigenous people in North America, because it was the kings in Europe, the crowns, that negotiated this. And as I told you last week, the Mi'kmaq people never gave their sovereignty to the French. They never surrendered their sovereignty to the French, and the French of France never asked for it. But if you read Marc Lescarbot, if you read Champlain, if you read the letters between Poutrincourt and people in Paris, in France, those letters talk about the king's sovereignty being transposed into North America. But they were careful not to tell the Indians about it, because they understood that the Indians didn't have any notion of property. They didn't have any notion of territoriality. When Europeans arrived here in North America, the Mi'kmaq welcomed them as fellow brothers and sisters. We all belong to Mother Earth. Come ashore and you belong here as well. We'll just show you how to prepare your food and so on and so forth. So that's how the French arrived. And when England decided to move northward, they decided in 1613, William Alexander from Scotland was given Nova Scotia by the British king, or the English king at the time. And he came, and this is how come Nova Scotia is called Nova Scotia. It's because of William Alexander that came here in 1613 and left by 1628. And everything just reverted back to the French. So France owned New France, Nouvelle France. And then the Razili arrived here with women and men and families. And they established themselves at Port Royal. And then some people moved across the river, and they moved themselves up the St. John River. And some of them arrived along the north shore, northern coast. And so eventually seigneuries were allocated to the French in this territory. So that kind of covers from 1630 right up to about the 1690s. And then the English start invading again into this territory. And like I was telling you, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 changed the events, because England came here and routed out the French and defeated the French, in fact. And so they took over sovereignty over the territory, but they didn't really move in, and they were at not Port Royal, they changed the name of it to Annapolis Royal. So they established themselves there, and eventually the French kind of like gathered together and started to instill fear among the English. 1620, 1622, treaties were made with the Eastern tribe and England down in towards Boston area. One is called Casco Bay, and the other one's called Saco Bay. Saco Bay is in Maine, and so some treaties were entered into in that area. 1722. Finally, a major treaty was entered into in Boston in 1725, and that's the treaty that the Indians call a major peace and friendship treaty of 1725, signed in Boston. The year later, they brought it up to Annapolis Royal, and the Mi'kmaq signed it. Lots of Mi'kmaq chiefs signed the treaty. They ratified the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1725, and it was ratified in 1726 at Annapolis Royal. So there was still kind of uneasiness in what they call Nova Scotia. New Brunswick was included, and Nova Scotia they were both called Nova Scotia. It was called l'Acadie or Nouvelle France at some point, and now it's called Acadia and Nova Scotia. So 1726, there was a lot of conflict going on between the French Acadian people on the land, with sometimes mixing up with the Mi'kmaq people, and the English came along and said, what about the Treaty of Peace and Friendship you signed? You said you're not going to get yourself involved in wars. And so there was a lot of kind of conflict going on. And then finally in 1749, Cornwallis arrives in a boat and arrives in Halifax and decides to establish his government in Cornwallis. I mean in Halifax. And he's operating his government out of a ship in the harbor in Halifax, while the soldiers are busy clearing Halifax, Signal Hill or Citadel Hill. I'm talking about St. John's, Newfoundland. Citadel Hill, it seems. Anyway, they cleared that area to build a barracks and start building houses for the residents to come in and establish this great city of Halifax. At the same time, Louisbourg, or Louisbourg, as the French would say it, it was routed out. It had been started in 1713. It wasn't finished until 1726, and it was attacked many times by the English. And finally, around 1747, it was ransacked and it was defeated. The French were surrendered, and everybody marched out. And again, somehow it was left unattended, and the French rebuilt themselves at Louisbourg. And 1752, a peace and friendship treaty was signed, a ratification of an earlier treaty. 1749, a treaty was signed at the mouth of the St. John River by the Passamaquoddies, the Maliseet, and the Mi'kmaq people. It was at what they called Fort Howe, at the mouth of the St. John River. This is where this treaty was signed in 1749. 3 years later, they signed another treaty in Shubenacadie. John Baptiste Cope signed this treaty and with the English. And John Baptiste Cope was recognized as the Grand Chief, the head of all the Mi'kmaq Nation. What the Mi'kmaq were pretty well known to do is they kind of transferred the Grand Chieftainship around to kind of decoy against the enemies, kind of attacking and killing their Grand Chief. So John Baptiste Cope, it was his turn to be the Grand Chief, and he negotiated a treaty with the English at Shubenacadie in 1752. And the English told the Mi'kmaq people, if you come to Halifax on October 1st, we'll give you blankets, lead, and gunpowder, flour, pork, and all this kind of goodies that you can take home to your families. So the Mi'kmaq have been gathering in Halifax on October 1st on Treaty Day. I'll get to that in a minute. Further on. So that was the Treaty of 1752, and things were kind of shifting. The English were battling the Acadian/French people in the Maritimes. They were attacking them around Port Royal, Annapolis Royal area, down Cape Sable. There was a large Acadian community down there. There was a big Acadian community around Port Royal or Annapolis Royal, Grand Pre, Minas Basin, and there was a lot of Acadian people here in Cape Breton in the North Shore around the Margaree area and along the Cabot Trail area. There's a major component, and then around Ile Madame, on the other side of the Canso Basin, there were Canso Bay, Canso Strait. I can't get off the island here. But there were Bay Saint George. There was also a French community in that area. So the Acadian people were quite large in number, and the British, the English, were having a hard time trying to control them, because the Mi'kmaq also were intermarried with the early Acadian French people, and sometimes the English had a hard time telling the difference between Acadians and Mi'kmaq or French people, and there was a great confusion. And by 1753, 54, and 55, the English decided they were going to ship the Acadians out of Nova Scotia. They would ship them out, and it is said that between 12 to 18,000 Acadian people were put on boats and ships, and they were shipped down to Louisiana, down to the East Indies, back across the ocean, some places in Africa, some places in England, some places in the Jersey Islands. Some of them were sent back to France. So 12 to 18,000, the figure is, Naomi Griffith has kind of come up with that figure, that approximation. It could be 12,000 or it could be 18,000. So they don't know exactly the numbers, and the records during that period were very skimpy, and so there was not a great amalgam of information that we can ascertain for certainty how many Acadians were shipped out of Nova Scotia. But basically, quite a lot of them between 1755 and 1763. And after the Royal Proclamation that Dr. David Wheeler mentioned about through Prince Charles, the Royal Proclamation settled things between England and France. It was sometimes it's called the Treaty of Paris, and it was a proclamation that was entered into between the French king and the English king, and together they made an agreement that France could keep the Quebec, that the French people in Quebec could keep their language, the French language. They could keep their laws, the Napoleonic Code, or what they call later on droit civil, and their religion, language, law, and religion, the Catholic religion in Quebec. So that was in the agreement in the Royal Proclamation. But also the Royal Proclamation said that all unoccupied territory that belonged to the Indian people in North America still belonged to the Indian people, and if anybody was going to acquire that land, Indian land, the Indians would have to agree to surrender that land back to the Crown, the British Crown, and that the Crown could grant it or sell it to its British subjects. So that was the nature of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. But still things were not settled here in North America. Like I said last week, down in the United States, there were people that were loyal to the king in England, and there were people that said, well, I've worked my blood, sweat, and tears to gain my life here in North America. Why should I pay taxes to the king in England across the ocean? And so these group of people that decided to start a republic of United States ganged together, and there were a few minor skirmishes, they called them battles, between the English-speaking people, loyalist and Americanist, I guess they called them. So they finally, from 1766 till 1783, the American Revolution raged on. And England was worried about the Indians in Canada, in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and its colony of North America. British North America was called. So they were worried about where the Indians were going to go. So they continued to treat the Indians by entering into treaty relationships.